But if for some reason you're not happy with the discussion part being recorded, then please just tell us later, because like people do benefit from the discussion, so we thought we would try and record it this time. So it's great to hear people using the chat, and please do continue to do that. Just put comments, introductions, put your questions in there. Yeah, we'll send a link later. If you can keep your mic off when you're not talking, that would be great. Those are all the kind of housekeeping things. Welcome, it's really lovely to see everybody. We're very fortunate to have with us a number of really great narrative scholars who are going to talk, albeit way too briefly, to us. So at the beginning, some people are going to kind of contextualize the book a little. That's going to be Mark Freeman, who is the editor of the Explorations in Narrative Psychology series, in which this book appears, and also Ken Plummer and Peace Kigua, all of them, you know, really wonderful narrative scholars of great depth and insight. So we're very lucky to have them with us today. And then we're going to hear from the authors again in, unfortunately, rather short periods of time, but this is how it goes on Zooms. Obviously, we don't want to keep people on Zoom till they kind of exhaust themselves. And also we do want to leave time for some discussion. So we've asked people to talk for like 5 minutes, some of the chapter authors. Not all of the chapter authors could be with us today, and we're now hoping to have a second discussion event related to the book later in the autumn with other chapter authors, and also hopefully with the wonderful artist who did this cover image, Carbon, did this image for the book. I think Shesa is also going to be talking about their work a little bit, or some of the photographers' work anyway in that. So we're going to spend a small amount of time here having roundtable contributions from those contributors, and then move to discussion with you all. And I'm very happy to say that my colleague Molly Andrews has agreed to help share this whole afternoon, so that's really great. Thanks Molly for volunteering to do that. So this book had a very long period of creation, starting post-financial crisis actually in the 2010s, and it had a little bit of support from the British Psychological Society, which wanted to support the development of qualitative methods. So we had a couple of meetings with the BPS, kind of under the aegis of the BPS, and people started to develop some ideas about chapters there. And then I think other conversations occurred around those ideas, particularly with our colleagues in our sister organization, NEST in South Africa, that is Narrative Inquiry for Social Transformation. Peace is here from NEST, and I'm sure some other people too. And also we had discussions with people from the Public Science Project in CUNY, New York, again, colleagues that here from that project, and many other discussions with actually some colleagues from Monash with whom we held the summer school Narrative Innovations. So it's been a process of accretion really to make this book and make it happen. And it did take a considerable amount of time, during which we actually changed from being the Centre for Narrative Research to being a broader based and independent association of narrative research and practice. And some sad things happened during that period of time too, particularly the death of Elliot Mishler, who was involved with the early discussions about the book, and sadly died before we reached the completion of the book. But his chapter with some of my rather inadequate final edits is in the book, in which he talks, I think, very helpfully and interestingly about the ways in which narrative as a form of action can amplify and prolong and give history to other kinds of social action. And then I think very sadly, in the time we were preparing for this event, a colleague who was a founder of NEST and a really key person within NEST, Becky Ziziwe Peterson, sadly died untimely. And Becky was a really, really amazing narrative scholar of real breadth and thoughtfulness and creativity. And I think his sense of narrative as a kind of narrative in relation to history actually kind of hovers under many of the chapters in this book. And also perhaps links this book to debates that we didn't think it was going to be linked to, rather, well, I didn't, stupidly, earlier on, you know, where it was a book about narrative and social change, narrative and social justice. Now, perhaps much more a book that we need to read in the context of narrative and socio-historical transformation. And that's something that Becky talks about all the time in his narrative scholarship. And also, I think this book now links something that Molly just said to a debate about something that Molly just mentioned, which is this sense now that we often have that narrative has become a kind of, is seen as a form of kind of persuasive emotivism, emotivism is a term from Alistair McIntyre, really quite dissociated from truth. This is something that Becky also talks about. So really, you know, the chapters in this book are not understanding narrative in that way. They understand narrative as a form of evidencing and theorizing of social formations and historical formations, much like Becky Peterson understood it, I think. So I don't think the chapters were not, you know, in the 2010s written against that sense of narrative as emotivism, but they do actually stand against it, I think, in a really important way. So I didn't write these chapters, so I can completely immodestly say that they are really wonderful chapters, very careful, very powerful, and I think quite significant for the present moment. So I'd urge you to find a way to read them if you can. I'm really looking forward to this, and I'm just going to hand over now to Molly, who's going to introduce the first presenters. Molly, thanks so much.
Okay, thanks, Corinne. Before I do that, I just need to really praise you, Corinne, because your spirit is not, you not only edited this book, but for a very, very long time, you have been such a glue to bringing people together to talk about the issues which are raised in this book. And I think, I mean, lots of us were parts of those events in 2007 and 2009. Actually preparing for this event was for me quite emotional. I was just remembering that time, and this is quite a different time. And I think that, you know, rereading your introduction, I mean, it speaks to me in a very different and very, very powerful way in this moment of the pandemic, and where we actually need desperately to be able to reimagine a new and different future. And, you know, Ken Plummer, amongst other people, but Ken has for a long time said that we can't do social change without stories. And so the question of the relationship between the stories and the imagining that we're trying to do is, it's quite a challenging task. And I just need to thank you, Corinne, so much for that. I found it very, very, I don't know what, very emotive rereading all of this and thinking how life has changed. I also want to point out that in the chat, Jill Bradbury has said, you know, this slow scholarship also means that this event is a celebration of friendships that have built in this time. And that's absolutely right as well. So it feels, and we all need each other at this moment, both as scholars, but also as comrades. So thank you so much for bringing us together, Corinne. So I will I'm just going to introduce Mark, Peace, and Ken. I have just one line really to say about each of them. But again, I want to say how much fun it is to do the background research on, you know, what can you say, how can you sum up in one line these people who have just been so important for us and in the field. But so that gave me the excuse to reread your backgrounds today, Peace, Ken, and Mark. But anyway, Mark Freeman, who is the editor of this book series, is the Distinguished Professor of Ethics and Society at the College of the Holy Cross. And as I said, he is the book editor of this series, Explorations in Narrative Psychology. Peace Kiguwa is the associate professor in the Department of Psychology and a very important part of the NEST network, which is very dear to so many of us. And of course, Ken Plummer, Ken is one of those public intellectuals who have always pushed us to think harder about the relationship between social change and stories. He's got so many. I did not realize that Ken's first book on sexual stigma was actually published in 1975. But he has written so many important, wonderful books on this, telling sexual stories. And most recently, if you haven't read it, an extraordinary book, The Power of Narrative. Before the pandemic, I had a wonderful, wonderful lunch with Ken, as we do from time to time. And he told me, quite immodestly, I said, "Oh, so what are you up to?" "Oh, not much. I mean, I've got a sketch for 5 more books, but, I'm on number 3 right now." I mean, Ken just keeps producing the most extraordinary work. So I will hand over to the 3 of you now, please. Mark, if you could speak in that order. So Mark, Peace, and Ken.
Thanks, Molly. Well, it's a great and special pleasure to be here with all of you today. As many of you no doubt know already, the book we're here to launch and to celebrate really is an excellent and significant one. And we'll be hearing more about that, obviously, in the time to come. The book also carries a dedication in fond memory of Elliot Mishler, who Corin just referred to, and whose work I'm sure many of you know. And what I want to do in the very few minutes I have is just to share a few words about him. I might note that I had the opportunity to do something similar last week at the annual meeting of the Society for Qualitative Inquiry in Psychology. So Elliot has been very much in the air recently. A little bit of background. For many years, a group of us from the New England area in the States had the great good fortune of having our own narrative research and practice group, which, through the kindness and generosity of Elliot and his partner, Vicki Steinitz, allowed us to descend on their home in Cambridge just about every month. I learned recently that that group had gone on for some 27 years. I didn't get there until, I don't know, maybe 7 years in or something like that. So it's been a long haul. And I must say, we're having something of a small reunion right now with the presence of Michael Bamberg, Brinton Likes, Arlene Katz, and Kathy Reisman. It's great to be with you all again. I had known some of Elliot's work beforehand, but I really didn't know him. His intellectual reach, his wisdom, his ability to offer sharp but constructive critique, all in the service of our growth, not only as scholars and writers, but as human beings. As many of you know, in addition to being a first-rate scholar in narrative inquiry and beyond, Elliot was a passionate and fiercely dedicated servant of social justice. As his obituary noted, he was, and I quote, "a critical scholar, photographer, and political activist. His household was a stew of ideas, politics, poetry, music, and social theory, all motivated by a strong love and compassion for the world. With his students and his family, and visitors like our group, he argued by asking questions. And he taught us all that to be human was to make the world more just." This is part of the obituary as well. He took his sons to their first demonstrations against the war in Vietnam in 1965, and he continued to fight against racism, militarism, and injustice throughout his life, including holding family reunions at marches against the war in Iraq. End quote. So Eliot was a remarkable person in so many ways. He was someone whose mind, heart, and soul were of a piece. And he was someone strenuously committed to exactly the kind of work that's found in Stories Changing Lives. Work that's intellectually rigorous, that never loses sight of flesh and blood persons, especially those suffering from marginalization, oppression, and violence, and that through it all remains infused with hope. Hope that measures can be taken to make the world better and more just. And that in some small way we can be part of the process. For many of us here today, Eliot will always find a special place in our own hearts and memories. This book will serve as a truly wonderful memento of his many and profound contributions to our scholarship and to our lives and to the lives of many others as well. Congratulations to Corinne for her careful editing and to all of the contributors here today who helped make it happen. I'm delighted to see it in print, and I'm really proud to have it as part of the series. So thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Peace, would you join us, please?
Only. So I would like to start with a remembrance as well, and that's to one of the co-founders of NEST, Becky Peterson. And I think his words, based on a film of his called The Zulu Love Letter, kind of captures what I want to convey today. And he said that he made this film, quote, "I created this film as a love letter to those who passed on, and those still tasked with creating a better future for all." And I think in many ways that not only captures the spirit of who Becky was, but in many ways captures all of us together here as a community. So I'm going to start by very briefly just giving a sense of my overall impression of the book. And then I want to kind of say something more broadly about narrative and my entry point into thinking about narrative and the work that narrative can do. So my sense of the book, all 9 chapters of this, is that in many ways the book uses and works with narrative as theory and method, as a way of thinking about 3 things: thinking about questions of human experience, thinking about questions of development, and thinking about questions of social change. And each one of these chapters starts from the premise that narrative in many ways is a defining feature of the way that we make our lives. So speaking across different lines of difference, speaking across different lines of existence, the chapters explore this transformative, and I'm glad that you mentioned this earlier, Corinne, this idea of transformative potential of narrative. And that's my sense of each one of these 9 chapters, using and demonstrating this transformative potential to think about what narrative can do in terms of thinking about people's lives, thinking about belonging, thinking about imaginations to the future, but also thinking about changing the present. At the same time, my sense was that some chapters spoke a lot more to narratives in terms of trying to think about how some narratives are textured by, I don't know, a politics and almost an embeddedness in melancholia, in woundedness, in pain. And this is not surprising because they speak into very different contexts, but also just thinking about our encounters with violence, with racism, with state failures, with alienation. So it is not surprising that you get these kind of thinking through hopeful narratives, but also thinking through narratives that kind of try to honor the woundedness and the trauma as well. And this has brought me to 3 kind of reflections in terms of thinking about narrative more broadly. And in many ways that seems to inform the way that I think about my work and my interest in working with narrative. 3 things here. The one is trying to think through the potential of narrative to disrupt. using narrative as an analytic medium for disruption. And located in South Africa at the moment, my particular interest in thinking about narrative and disruption has in many ways stemmed from thinking through how certain kinds of archives get read, but always in relation to erasure. So erasing other kinds of narratives. I'm trying to think, for example here, when we were at the height of the student protest in South Africa, and trying to think through the idea of a decolonized university and what that could look like. The ways in which particular kinds of narratives and reading of the Black archive, reading narratives of race, in many ways seemed to happen alongside a kind of erasure of other imaginations of the university, feminist erasures, queer erasures, and all of that. So I'm very interested in that idea of disruption and how we could use narrative to disrupt these kinds of erasures. The other thing that really interests me about narrative, and I'm drawing on a description that comes from a colleague and friend of mine, Grace Musila, which is this idea of wicked imagination. And so trying to think through the idea of how narratives in many ways can also do the work of wounding and hurt. So to be attentive to the ways that we need to be careful about the work that narrative imagination can do. It's not just about hopeful futures, but trying to think about these encounters with violence, these encounters with racism, and how in many ways these worlds, these imagined worlds, stem from a particular kind of, for lack of a better word, a bad narrative imagination. So I'm also attentive to that. But thirdly, I am interested in the idea of the limits of narrative and trying to think through what it is that we can do with narratives in terms of thinking about transformative possibilities, but also trying to think through, well, what could be the limits of narrative in terms of trying to capture these everyday complexities and trying to work with this. So to bring it and circle it all back to the book, this is it for me. When I read this book, in many ways, all of these chapters weave together the possibilities in terms of thinking about narrative transformations. And I think in many ways, what they do is that they invite us to think together, to despair together, to rage together. But in all of that, they also invite us to dream together. And that for me was the beauty of the book. Thank you.
Thank you, Peace, so much for those comments. Before we go to Ken, I just want to remind some of you were there in the 2009 conference when our wonderful Sienda challenged Pumla Godobe Madikizela, and he said, look, it's not, what Zimbabwe needs is not a new narrative, okay? We need new politics. And he really strong, I think that what you're saying so much, he was so angry because there was this sort of romanticization about narratives and the power for healing. And he's like, sometimes we just need a different politics. So thank you for saying that here. Sorry for abusing my role as chair there. Ken, please.
Thank you much. Well, first of all, I just wanted to congratulate you and Corinne for bringing this little assemblage together, because it's gone unnoticed so far that this is the first meeting of the so-called newly founded Association of Narrative Research and Practice. And I know you've been through many suffering months, maybe even years, with your home-based university that's sort of thrown you out. And I just wanted to comment on that to start with, to remind us of the background to this. And this book was produced in that university at that time. And it's been a difficult time, but it's nice to see this association emerging from it. And I just wanted to congratulate you on getting it together. So, sorry. When I first saw the program today, I wrote to Corinne a rather sort of abusive letter and said something like, you cannot get through this in an hour and a half. It's absolutely impossible. And she said, yes, we can if people are controlled and measured and careful. And so far, I have to say people have been. So I'm going to have hard to follow this, but never mind. So I was first engaged with the book when I was asked to write a blurb for it and read it and blurb it about, I don't know, 2 years ago or so. And I found it a very, very impressive and interesting book. What I'd like to do very quickly is raise 4 issues that are worrying me at present around narrative. In the time I've got, just try and show how this book touches on certain aspects of these, if I can. But I will keep my eye on the clock. And the 4 issues are narrative worlds, narrative struggles, narrative futures, and narrative humanity. The most complicated one is the last one, and I probably won't talk about that because it's a very contested zone. But a whole series of questions come into mind. So narrative worlds. The first assumption is that we all live in a pluriverse of social worlds. That's how the world is constituted. And those worlds are always irrevocably bound up with narrative formations. Groups create narratives and their social worlds simultaneously, so to speak. And this book really, in one sense, is demonstrating these particular set of worlds that people have constructed through narrative in different ways. And so we find here victim worlds, community activist worlds, genocide worlds, even in Guatemala, racial violence in Texas, Black lives of students at the University of Cape Town, and so forth. It's a whole series of narrativization of little social worlds. And the interesting thing for me about the notion of narrative worlds is a very old theoretical question about what I'll now call, for simplicity, micro-narratives and macro-narratives. And this is a book stuffed full of micro-narratives, really, of very finely tuned analyses of people's sufferings and pains in a whole series of different worlds, in which they're creating their stories, they're giving voice to their traumas and so forth, and that's all coming forward. And that's vital, and vast amounts of work are now being done in this mode. But the second level, if you like, the macro narrative level, which is the canopies in which we live, the broad, what used to be called, in the very old-fashioned word, it's almost banned now, is ideologies. But if you like, narrative ideologies are the wider frameworks in which we live. And it seems to me that everybody's struggling towards getting there, but there's no formal statements and there's no real analysis of the rotten world we live in a big frame. And so I feel very guilty in saying that, because when I started out, I was obsessed with the details of narrative. This is a long time ago. And I've watched myself slowly moving away from what's really wonderful about narrative, which is the detail, to a much more kind of abstracted mode of thinking about it, or a bigger picture, so to speak. And so that's my first little pondering, really, about the book, that I kind of, in the end, wanted to also see this bigger picture that we're all struggling towards, and so forth. So the second broad topic is narrative struggles. All narratives are about struggles, from Gilgamesh to Harry Potter. We are talking about contestation, conflicts, disagreements, and one level or the other. All narrative seems to me to be driven by struggle, by contestation. And it raises issues always about power, about voices not being heard and silenced, and most importantly for me, human values, that they're all displaying human values of some form or the other. We're disagreeing about the values we should be holding or whatever. And this book, of course, very strongly, every chapter is about struggle. It's about narrative struggle in one form or the other. And you can see the changes and the conflicts that are going on throughout the book. If we just look at the very first chapter, Corinne flags the chapter really as being about the social justice function of stories, the social justice function. And so the central struggle the whole book's about really is social justice. That is, of course, only one struggle. And other books are about other kinds of struggles, but it's a very important struggle. And I would say the book is also not just about justice struggle. It's really much of the book is about racialized justice struggles. It's not, for example, very much about queer struggles or disability struggles or other struggles, but it's very important about racialized justice. What we find throughout this kind of account is that a group is struggling to find a political voice. That's found in virtually every chapter. A voice that was silenced is being brought out, and is also trying to produce a macro statement about social justice. So that's my second thing, that it's a book about narrative struggles. And thirdly, it's about narrative futures. Now, we've already commented upon that the book's about change. And if you look at the title, the very title contains the word change twice. Stories changing lives and narratives and paths towards social change. And so it's there at the heart of the book, this transformation that's taking place, both in terms of the micro and the macro. The world is changing for people through their narratives and so forth, but also in their acts of telling their stories, they're changing the world. The bigger world is changing too. I mean, in my own kind of work on gay life over many years, I mean, I've seen that work so successfully. It's kind of my model for thinking about it. That, you know, as we were all in the 1960s and 70s coming out and transforming ourselves, so we were really beginning to nudge very slowly. It took a good 50 years just in some countries to really change the public narrative. So now our Prime Minister is quite happy to drape his house with the gay flag and Gay Pride Week, which, you know, is just unbelievable from 50 years ago. But it's moving, if you like, the stories out into the public world and so forth. So the questions we ask really are here about how our narrative changes build out new social imaginaries. This is one way of thinking about it. How it brings from, if you like, our daily practices now, which may or may not be working, but the idea of grounded utopias where we can see the possibilities for new and better worlds for all through various actions. And the world is littered with examples of this, where people are acting in the world through their narratives to change the world and make it a better place. It's rich in those things going on everywhere. And this book beautifully demonstrates the 8 or 9 major case studies of it, but there are thousands, millions of others going on. And so one of the things I would be arguing for, and again, which the book doesn't do, but we can move on to the next stage, so to speak, is to think about future narratives where these stories are taking us. They're all taking us into a new world. They're all suggesting new worlds where racial hostilities and violence and all kinds of conflicts will have to be reduced, and if not, eliminated. So we're building up a picture of a better world for all in a multiplicity of different stories around different areas, and a new set of values. I would then add to that, the values are not just around justice, but around care, around sustainability, depending upon which group you're looking at. And you know, there's a myriad of different judges of values to pursue the world into a better place. So as I thought, I cannot do narrative humanity, that's for another time. But I see this as a big umbrella, as a kind of wish, a dream for a world to be a better place, to actually believe in a common humanity, which is not, of course, how we see the world at present.
Thank you, Ken. That gives us a lot to think about. And yes, narrative humanity for the next time. Corinne, are you introducing this next bit?
I am. Thank you very much, Ken, and the other contributors. That was really a great way to start off and indeed to think about future work. I'm just going to now introduce some of the people who wrote chapters, who are just going to speak briefly, I think, about some points that we can take up, hopefully, in discussion. And although I was going to go through the chapters as they appear in the book, I know that Chose has to leave us fairly early. So I'm going to ask Chose Kessie to start us off, if that's okay. Chose, are you there? So Chose is an associate professor of psychology at UCT, and she is also, I think, still Dean of Humanities, which sounds impossible at the same time.
Yeah, I'm just doing the deanship right now, Corinne.
Oh, good. Okay. Anyway, lovely to have you here.
Thank you. I'm just gonna, and thanks everyone. It's nice to meet everybody. Thank you, Corinne, for the book and for organizing today. I'm just gonna share my screen because I thought, given that my work is on Photo Voice, it's always nice to actually see the photos. So I'm gonna hopefully make this work. Can everybody see that?
Yep.
Okay, great. So the chapter is based on a, I'm trying to keep track of time. This chapter is based on a Photo Voice study with Black students at the University of Cape Town. And basically what I'm writing about in the chapter is the collection of narratives and representations of racialized difference that students spoke about from their experiences at the university. And I used Photo Voice, which is a participatory action research method, which involved the collection of stories through photographs and captions. And we had a series of exhibitions, because I guess the aim of using participatory action research method is really around social change and social justice. So I wasn't just asking students to tell their stories, but also working with them to mobilize them to bring about change in their environment. And so the exhibitions formed a really important part of that, as we got a lot of students and leadership, people in leadership positions, or just generally people in the university coming to look at the exhibition and seeing what they had to say. So I thought I would just share with you a few of the stories. This first one is a lot of the students spoke about there's common themes that always come up about feelings of inferiority, especially the inferiority of Blackness. And they're confronted with discourses around Black students coming into the university and bringing down standards. So there was a lot of stories. I think there's a level of irony here about how, historically everything was white, and but the idea really is about how Black students are always having to catch up, and I mean catch up in a kind of inverted commas catch up. And so I'm not giving you the whole stories, but just some of the captions here. And I think one of the ones that really speaks to me is "Where they go, we shall follow." And here again, sorry, this story called Step by Step, and I thought it was quite interesting. You can see the Black students sitting on the step a bit lower down from the two white students above. And there again, bringing back that theme of having to catch up. There was also a number of stories in my project that looked at how these ideas of Blackness came about in the cultural symbols across campus. So the artworks, we all know about the story of Cecil John Rhodes and the statue falling, but the students spoke a lot about artwork. And in this particular case, this piece of artwork was hanging in the Harry Oppenheimer building, which houses the Center for African Studies. And the students described how they felt uncomfortable with this piece because what it demonstrates is Black bodies hanging from the ceiling. So kind of reminiscent of ideas of lynching. And then finally, this is the cover of the book. And this was a student who talks about their experience in student residence. And this is a gender non-conforming student. And I think what's interesting is that there was a series of stories that looked at the intersections of race with other aspects of identity. And here the student talks about the experience of staying in Graça Machel Hall, which was named after President Mandela's wife, Graça Machel. And so the young women who stay there are nicknamed First Ladies. So a very uncomfortable space for somebody who's gender non-conforming. And the student says, my ID tells lies about who I am. I'm subhuman, so I don't deserve a restroom. The language to accommodate me does not exist in the vocab of the majority. And even when I come home, this space expects me to be a first lady. Home should not be violent. There's no space in which I am acknowledged and validated. There are only spaces that tell me who I am. So I conclude the chapter by just talking about how since the dismantling of apartheid in 1994, there's been a lot of assumptions about race and changes in universities, when in fact the experience, well, there's been a lot of demographic change, but in fact the experience a lot of students remains one of racialized difference. And very alienating and dehumanizing experiences at time. And so through this project, through the narratives of the students, they were kind of enabled to disrupt some of those racializing narratives. Corinne, let me end there. Thank you.
Shoso, thank you so much. That really, I think, instantiated some of the things that Peace and Ken were also saying. So thanks so much. That was really a great introduction to the chapter. Thank you. Thanks so much. Can we go to Molly? We'll go through now from the first. Molly's was one of the first chapters, so we'll go to Molly. If you're there, Molly, do you want to speak?
Yes, sure. I'm going to share my screen as well here. Hold on. So I will, I just need to see, sorry, need to see what you see here. Perfect. Fine. So I'm going to hopefully give you a brief overview of the chapter that I contributed to this book. And despite the fact that for the last few decades, I've actually been collecting stories of political activism in different settings, which are sort of much more clear, straightforward stories about stories which lead to social change. I chose one that actually was a bit more opaque and open to interpretation. So I'm not going to, this is part of a long-term project that I was doing, that I've been doing over 28 years in East Germany. And this is just a small segment from an interview in 2012 with this person, Jens Reich, who was the one of the leaders of the citizens movement in 1989. And here we are 20 years, well, 25 years almost after the opening of the wall. And I ask him, I say, well, what was your experience like looking at your Stasi files? And he says, well, it was much fun. It was a lot of fun. And I say, not painful. Afterwards, of course, you were, well, one who rides over the frozen lake in the midst. Only afterwards on the meadow who realizes that the ice is very thin. And then he goes on to say, one thing I will never understand is how the Stasi could have achieved what they did with the book of Werner Stiller. There was the book of a defector, a high officer of the Stasi who defected in the early 80s to the West and then wrote a book about the internal affairs of the Stasi. This book was extremely useful for us because there was a lot of information about how the Stasi is organized, how they deal with opposition, and so on. I got a copy of this book. It's a digression. And we all know that when people say it's a digression, you should listen closely. I got a copy of this book from a very different, dangerous way. A friend of ours emigrated to the West and was active politically there and couldn't come to East Berlin any longer. He was in West Berlin. but he sent his 12-year-old daughter to visit grandparents in the East. In order to do me an important favor, he gave this girl the booklet, which she stored in her underpants. She was used to going. The children were allowed to cross at Friedrichstrasse, so she was not searched. It could have been very dangerous. So she came and she draws this thing out, this extremely dangerous thing, this book. And I circulated it with friends, people who were very thankful. And then he tells this story about, he goes on a holiday and he wraps the book in plastic and he stores it in the basement. We had a basement which we never used, and there was coal there, and he buries it into the coal. It was completely rotten and wet coal, and the basement was full of spiders, et cetera, et cetera. And then he says, when he came back from the holiday, he said, they found it. It was away when we came back. It was a shock for me when I went down after our vacation to get it. The coal box was, well, they had found it somehow. I don't know how they could have found out. And I say, trying to lead him back to this question, I say, oh, was this in your files, in your Stasi files? And he says, no, I don't know what they could have done. Of course, if they had put me, I would have been in jail. I would have been a real spy. With that, they could have jailed me for years. And I said, but they didn't. They didn't put it into his file. No, it disappeared. I cannot say more. To this day, I don't know the reason where it disappeared. Perhaps it was like what happened in the lives of others. It was a guy who himself hid it and put it aside, read it and put it into the dustbin. So these are all conjectures. And what I do in this chapter is I try to offer a narrative analysis of this very brief extract. And I'm not going to go through this now, but just to say that I go through different characters and how they play into this narrative. And what are the different possible storylines that he is indicating here? And what we are, the sort of the main character of the story, this infiltrator, is somebody whose existence we have to guess about. And their motives, who they were, did they know Reich, etc. And what I would say for me is that this story represents what Mark Freeman has termed the presence of the absence. It's a very, very powerful story, but it's in fact a story that has no conclusion. It's got a very enigmatic non-ending. And this for me is all the more engaging. Jens Reich presents me with this puzzle. He says, to this day, I don't know the reason. And this invites me into his challenge for making a sense of what remain inexplicable events. And for me, this story really hooks me in. And with his trying to tell the story, not only of what happened, but his insinuations of what could have happened, the importance of the unsaid story. And for me here, this demonstrates how the power of a story that is ultimately about knowing that he does not know. He says throughout, he reiterates this sense of not knowing. He said, this is something I'll never understand. I don't know how they could find out. Till this day, I don't know the reason. And as I say here, this narrative is unusual in that it hinges on a moment where the narrator is absent. And it is also what's most important, what's most powerful about this story is what did not happen. An alternative which is imagined, the once fully possible future of being jailed for having this dangerous object. So what do we learn from this story? Well, I think it's very rich. We see the risk that people were willing to take to promote their opposition to the state, the camaraderie that they shared with fellow underground activists, this pervasive feeling of surveillance. What's really important is to remember that this story is told to me nearly 25 years later. And this continued lack of certainty which surrounds the activities of the Stasi. So for me, it's a very haunting tale. And as I say here, its expansive gray shadows linger still. And I think it indicates for us this powerful call of stories which do not have a clear beginning middle and end, and nor even a clear plot line. So thank you.
Molly, thanks so much. That's really, really lovely to hear about. I mean, also, I've just been reading some of Becky's work around, I think, hauntology. It's a kind of aspect of narrative work that comes out of many different contexts, I think. Thank you. Could we move to Jennifer O'Mahony? Jennifer, are you there?
I am.
Hi, Jennifer. I know you're at Waterford Institute of Technology, right? I wasn't going to introduce you in any more length, but I hope that's okay. Nice to see you.
So hi, everyone, and thank you for your time this afternoon or this morning or evening, depending on where you are in the world. I'm presenting today on behalf of myself and my co-author for the chapter, Irina Anderson. And just briefly want to mention content warning. There is a little bit of discussion of sexual violence and some swearing. Swearing is not offensive to me, but I've realized it is offensive to certain people. So just in case, to let you know through some of the quotes. So I wanted to really kind of echo Corin and Molly's introduction around this idea of sort of future thinking. And this was something that Ken mentioned as well. And I'm a lecturer in psychology and very much trained within the kind of traditional methods of psychology that I always resisted. And I always felt were very, very limiting. And it disturbs me even now. And those of you that are still lecturing in psychology will probably have come across this, that this drive towards this concentration in clinical and particularly neuropsychology to the detriment of social psychology and all of those areas of contextualization that are so important. And we know through evolutionary studies that really what's kept our species alive is this kind of unique ability to form social networks through stories. And our ability to engage in social change and social cooperation is always framed within that ability to communicate through stories. And it does really concern me that we seem to be moving away from that rather than actually moving towards it. And really the strength in stories is so paramount that these sorts of publications and the community that's being built around this work, I think is ever so essential. So my work always has sat within the intersection of psychology and social justice, and particularly through narrative and testimony. And from the Irish context, it resonates quite a bit with me. What I hear from the presenters from Cape Town is this sort of post-colonial narrative and how we engage in identity formation, having had you know, a regulatory sort of system in place, and then all of a sudden this issue of identity in the center of it. So my chapter is much more specific than that, in that it focuses on experiences of sexual violence, but that overarching context, I think, that Ken was emphasizing is really essential for us to understand. And the focus of psychology and this kind of obsession on generalizability ignores the particulars of the individual person. So there's this fraughtness between acknowledging that micro story as well as that macro story to understand the context as well as the individuality within that. And I think narrative really reorients the person back into the physical body, the social relationships, and the cultural world that they sit in. So this chapter really looking at the subjective and personal narrative meaning making of survivals of sexual violence, and that idea of telling a story to engage a response. We tell people all the time in sexual violence work that you need to talk, you need to tell somebody what's happening to you. The reality of the context is, in Ireland, for instance, just last week, we found out that the Gardaí, our national police force, cancelled 22,000 phone calls from people ringing to a domestic violence hotline during COVID. They just hung up. They didn't want to deal with them. That is the proof that we have. So the reality is this kind of, you know, please express yourself, please tell your story, it will result in change, it will get you to where you need to go, is not the lived reality for many people. So telling their stories often, I feel in a sort of academic sense, or telling stories for research, is about creating a historical mark and creating a record that is not being created in other avenues for people. So there's a lot of power in that. And I think as researchers, and certainly from my own point of view, there is a lot of pressure, I think, that comes with that as well. There's a lot of responsibility in hearing those stories and responding to them appropriately. So these stories have that individual psychological purpose and a much bigger socio-cultural purpose. And this context in the UK, for instance, I looked up the UK stats just before coming on the call, and they're almost identical to the stats in Ireland and universally, that about 90% of those who disclose rape either through crisis centres or to the police force know their perpetrator. And only about 15% that we can guess actually report the crime. So these are stories about a very, very hidden crime, a very, very hidden issue that we're asking people to sort of perform in some way. So I'm just going to share one slide here, and to give you a little bit of where my concerns sit, and this is what's highlighted in the chapter, is we're bombarded with these sort of memes of transformation, right? We talked a little bit about that already today, that stories have that power. But there's a bit of toxic positivity with this. The idea that in the first image, you move from victim, then you're a survivor, then you're a thriver, then you're an inspirer, and that you have to work through this. And you can imagine for somebody who might identify being at the victim part, that's a bit overwhelming, that you're sort of expected to work through this catalog of labels before you can get past this, or you can cope with it, or whatever way we want to frame it. And these memes are often used, with the absolute best of intentions by, therapeutic agencies, crisis centers, and so on. But it's all about moving on. It's all about change, and it's all about, you're expected to move on. You're not expected to sit in this identity of victim. So there's the double-edged sword of being seen as a victim, because in some ways it opens doors. It acknowledges that you were a victim of a crime, and that's important. And in other ways, it's a very, very uninspiring and sort of re-traumatizing sense of what's happening. So we find, I think it's not surprising then, that narratives of sexual victimization tend to still follow a victim trope. And I have read, many, many texts going back sort of, from 50 years on, and you start despairing a little bit, because we're not saying that we've moved on in society. We haven't gotten to a point where we are telling a different victim trope. We are telling the same one. And that reflects that, culturally, we're not shifting, we're not responding to these stories. We aren't developing past the problematic issues that we've seen in the past. So a lot of the work, my earlier work, looked at this idea of the term victim versus survivor, and how that manifests in stories within that culturally sort of stereotype trope that is one of the few areas, I think, in psychology that is universal, that we can sort of say, no matter where you look, no matter what culture you look at, there's strong similarities in the way that victim trope manifests and is told. And it's heavily linked, of course, to blame as a coping factor with sexual violence. So my chapter looks at then agency and social change within these narratives. And it was really telling to me that in this study, which involved in-depth narrative analysis of 10 participants, 5 men and 5 women, overwhelmingly, they resisted these narratives. And I wasn't actually expecting that. It was one of the earlier studies that I engaged with. So this is just a very brief quote from one of the studies. So the participant is male, Paul. So he says, yeah, the experience was horrible, to say the least. And I respond saying, well, you're certainly a survivor, to say the least. And he immediately resists it and says, no, I'm a regular guy who had a horrible fucking thing happen to him. I'm trying to be normal now. And this idea of kind of rejecting immediately that identity of survivor, and that contrary to survivor is being normal, right? That these are two different things for him. And his identity was really important, and this was something that was tracked the whole way through his narrative, and it intersected with issues around, gender, his gender identity, his sexual identity, and so forth. So he makes a point of, coming across as having humor. He sort of laughs at the statements he's making, but really it's about rejecting what I said, that I put this label there that he didn't agree with. And this sort of rejection of those labels, any label of victim or survivor, became very, very important in this work. And really where I hope or see that it will have impact is really contributing to wider policy discussions around, methods for counselling, who gets counselling and who doesn't, what type of counselling. In Ireland at the moment, there's an obsession with CBT. If it's not CBT, nobody wants to know about it. The reality of CBT is you have to have strong actual narrative capabilities. You have to be able to enter your own stories, reflect on those stories, see where they're limiting you and so forth. It's a basic concept of CBT, is identifying those patterns. That does not apply to everybody. That doesn't apply to a large number of people who have experienced sexual violence. So the discrepancy, I think, between the experts and what they do with language and story versus the people who are experiencing these traumas in life, I think is something that we need to pay attention to moving forward as well. And it's about improving, again, education and understanding personal trajectories as being, while incredibly individual, also contribute to a larger coherent narrative around these topics as well, more broadly. So I'm going to stop there because of a tendency then I'm just going to keep going for a long time. That's the lecture part that I can't rein it in. So thank you everyone for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. I mean, everybody has that tendency, obviously. I'm just going to remind people about the 5 minutes, but I think people are doing their very best. And thanks so much for that kind of re-emphasis on narrative dissent, I guess, which was really interesting to hear. Could we go to Michael now? Michael Murray, who's Emeritus Professor at Keele University, and also contributed one of the chapters in the earlier part of the book. Michael, hi.
Okay, thanks, Corinne.
Hi.
And thanks a lot for inviting me to contribute to this and for sticking with me despite various changes. What I thought I'd focus on in this chapter is a selection of written autobiographies by some social activists. I'd been working previously with some community activists, talking to them and working with them, and it encouraged me to read some of the limited work by social activists. And as we know, autobiographies are an extremely popular form of literature. Indeed, if you go into any bookstore, you'll find loads of examples of autobiographies, and they have been so for hundreds, if not thousands of years. We've got the great religious stories, which talk about self-sacrifice and redemption. We've got lots of books by political and military leaders who are often self-aggrandizing, claiming credit for various successes and justifying any negative actions. But increasingly in the last generation, we have lots of books by what we could describe as ordinary people, especially ones who've experienced some form of trauma. And these are now going under the name of biographies. Trauma ranging from abuse to chronic illness and different types of injustices, which have particularly affected them. But my chapter focuses on the autobiographies of social activists, which are somewhat different. Not only do they highlight social injustices, the prime thing is to encourage the reader to identify with the author, and particularly to inspire the reader to engage in social action through following the example set down through the stories of their own lives. Now, one of the things I found when I looked at the stories of community activists, there was a limited number of these published. And this goes along with, I think Molly talks about it in one of her books, about the reluctant narrators, those people who have been involved in social struggles, but are often feel rather embarrassed about talking about their individual contribution. They feel that boasting is rather self-serving, and they would prefer to say that they were part of a broader movement. And in the case of community activists, one additional factor is that these were often women who were involved in it, and women are quite often even more avoidant of boasting about their contribution and are often excluded from any sort of credit for actions which were achieved. But reading through these accounts of social activists, one of the things is there's the common narrative structure, the beginning, middle, and end. The beginning is quite often the description of their family background, which is often involves political struggle from their parents. Then some sort of epiphany or catalyst encourages them to actually get involved themselves in something. Then we get a series of examples of struggle which they were involved with, and particularly highlighting not only their successes but their failures, and then going on to reassess exactly what they had done and locating their community work within a broader social narrative. Exactly what is the contribution of community struggle in the broader society where there are so many social injustices. So I focus on two books by Scottish community activists, because that's where I'm located now. And the first one is by Helen Crummy, which is this one here, which talks about, and Helen Crummy lives in Edinburgh, or she did live in Edinburgh, she's dead now. And one of the things about her book, which distinguishes from the other one I talk about, is what could be described as the cooperative nature of her autobiography. She's seen as clearly a representative of a collective who are involved in social change. In her case, she grew up in an inner city slum, and then she was rehoused on the edge of the city and found there was no sort of social and community facilities. And she began to work with others to try to obtain more facilities by organizing various demonstrations. And then when she found out there was some resistance, she got involved in organizing community arts events and a whole community festival. And so she describes how she went about this. And then in her reflections, she talks in particular about what she describes, and she re-emphasizes this consistently, is the ignored talents in our community. And she says we shouldn't be surprised at this. The world is full of people who never have the opportunity of participating fully and displaying their talents. And by community action, she has shown that when the opportunity is given, people can display something which they never thought they had the ability to do so. And through the work, and this is the other thing she emphasized, through the collective nature of her work, she is modeling a new society. We are not doing this for individual self-aggrandizement, but rather we are a community. In our actions, we work together. And in her committee, she emphasized that we're all in this together. None of us are anything particular. We're all working together to achieve what she describes as a caring and sharing society. Now, the second book by a woman called Kathy McCormick, who is a social activist from the neighboring city of Glasgow, is somewhat different in that Kathy's book was co-authored by a journalist. And this turns the book into somewhat more of a, you wouldn't want to emphasize this because of the great work that Kathy has done, but it turns Kathy into almost a hero-like figure rather than part of a collective engaged in social struggle. The background is somewhat similar. She comes from a certain family background who had been involved in political action. And then at an early age, she becomes pregnant and moves into a housing scheme on the edge of the city. And she finds that the housing is completely inadequate, particularly dampness, and she gets involved in a community campaign to improve the housing conditions. But one thing that she emphasizes throughout the book was the conflict which she was drawn into, not only with authority, which would be expected, but the conflict with her neighbors, who quite often would criticize her publicly and privately about what they felt that she was rushing ahead of them, and she thought that she was better than them. And this felt that she was depressed and socially isolated, and she would turn to others for assistance outside the community. And then coming to it, looking back on it, she begins to reflect upon what she describes as the power of vision. She had spent time in Nicaragua and in South Africa, and from her talks there, she'd become aware of liberation theology and popular education. And she began to say that what we need in Glasgow was a radical vision which people could rally around, and they could begin to take control of their lives and agitate for social change. But at the same time, there was this hesitancy, because in discussion with people, what she found was that people would criticize her for running ahead of them and alienating the community. And she had to have this balance between rushing ahead and actually trying to engage with them. So some common themes. The main thing was that this tension between the individual and the community, frustration and anger at the social injustice and what they described as the hidden talents, the power which a community could exert in actually mobilizing for social change, but the dangers of social isolation of the community activists, that they be involved in mockery and criticism. And in many ways, this is a classic case of religious leaders and any sort of thing, any sort of person who takes a leadership role, that if they're seen as self-aggrandizing, that they can be easily isolated and criticized by their community. So just some tensions. We have this tension between a community leader working with you as against a community leader working for you. Working with you where you immerse yourself in the community, and working for you where you rush ahead of the community and are seen to isolate yourself from them. The tension between individual action and collective action, and then this tension between doing something in the community and the issue of the broader social and political change. And both books come up with much more reference to their political context and the problems which they experience in trying to implement community change when there's so much broader injustices in society. So there we are. I'll leave it at that, Corinne.
Michael, thanks so much. It's a lot to convey quickly, but I think it makes this a really evocative chapter in terms of making links between that work and some of the work done in other country contexts across the book. And you pointed out some of those parallels yourself there. Thank you. Thanks so much. We're going to continue with Michelle and Lauren, I think, who are going to talk about one of the later chapters in the book, and then Brinton. And then we'll hopefully have a little time for discussion. We're supposed to finish at 4:30, but we can go over a little bit, I think. So Michelle and Lauren, I think you're going to arrange that among yourselves, right?
We're good. We're good. Thank
Right.
you. Thank you, Karin and Molly. And it's so great to see that narrative research cannot be suppressed even by neoliberalism. So thank you for resurrecting. I am going to frame this very briefly. My colleague, Lauren Cahill, who's a new faculty member at Smith College, will present most of this. We are speaking on behalf of our co-authors, Alyssa Del Tufo, Donnie Cook, Lauren Chinyere Okafor. Our project and our chapter is situated in a beautiful space of solidarity in Texas, the United States, a coalition of historically Black colleges and universities working with Black church, working with Black activists, and bringing in a set of oral historians. They invited people of color, mostly elders in Texas, to come forth and narrate stories of racial injustice, historic and contemporary. They were training young people from these historically Black colleges to gather the stories. And we were just really fortunate through Alyssa's connections to be invited down to bear witness to this beautiful intergenerational enactment of solidarity. So if I have 4 big points to make in 30 seconds, because I love Brinton and want to give her space, I would say that this project was very much about narrative as solidarity. It had all the beauty and pitfalls of truth and reconciliation spaces. The second was that it was a space of narrative as refusal. These testimonies were a refusal of the dominant stories of white supremacy that circulate in history books and classrooms, in the media in the United States. In some ways, this was narrative as a critical midwifery of critical race theory, which is now so fiercely being contested in our country. So it was narrative as refusal. The third was narrative as responsibility. These young people were co-constructing stories and then felt accountable to the elders to carry these stories to other audiences. And these were stories that they had not learned either at home or in their schools. And the fourth, as Pete suggested, was narrative as disappointment. People came to give their stories, but they thought we were going to help them with rent, with legal issues, with housing. And all we could do was offer the opportunity to accompany and bear witness. I guess I want to make a friendly amendment to my friend Ken Plummer and say this is an article that takes seriously the power of small stories to reveal historic fractures in the design of the United States and in the dominant ideologies. And it's our work to piece together the small stories to tell a grander narrative. So my colleague and friend Lauren Cahill, new professor, take it away.
Thanks so much, Michelle. As Michelle mentioned, this work that we did in Texas was based around the truth and reconciliation model. And each time a narrator told a story, they were passing it down to a younger generation of HBCU students who became their narrative collectors. Together, these small cadres of Black collectives were able to create a ritual of transformation, if you will, by recalling stories of their past. In the process of releasing their embodied trauma of these racist, sexist, and classist experiences, healing was able to occur. Audre Lorde speaks quite beautifully about this in one of her shorter essays entitled The Uses of Anger. And in this essay, she writes, "My anger has meant pain to me, but it has also meant survival. And before I give it up, I'm going to be sure that something at least as powerful as it is able to replace it on the road to clarity." So like Audre Lorde, we were overwhelmed by our observation of these Black narrators through their storytelling, their ability to find power in their anger and their survival in deep places for clarity. These students and these narrators were also able to enter a new place of intergenerational inheritance and imagination from the future they were being gifted and the radical persistence of those who came before them. And we felt that it was our duty as women scholars to really bring an intersectional lens to the scholarship. And we chose specifically to highlight the stories of Black women. And we highlighted the specific story of Quinn in our chapter, her experience with wrongful termination from United Airlines. We also wanted to detail how Quinn as a narrator often broke the third wall between not just the narrative collectors, but also the documentarians in the room and us as ethnographers. She closed out her experience by saying to all of us, "I love my Blacknicity and yours," and gave each and every one of us hugs. And in doing so, she really reminded us that even though we're differently situated, that through this collective experience of Blackness, that we will most assuredly all encounter forms of discrimination in our lives. And that we should be committed to the truth of our lived experiences and love ourselves, even though when the world may tell us not to. So I just wanted to definitely reiterate with what Dr. Kagua mentioned at the beginning of this talk, that we can't undervalue the intensity involved with spending several hours of listening to these stories of Quinn and others about these historic continuities of structural violence, dispossession, and resistance. But we, by and large, left that session and most of those sessions invigorated by hugs, hope, and healing. And I won't speak for other members of my team, but the intergenerational recognition and reckoning that occurred during our time together deeply impacted me, and we hope that it moves other readers as well. Thank you so much. I'll pass back to Corinne, I believe.
Lauren and Michelle, thanks so much. That was a great review of what is a very densely packed chapter, I think, and also really helpful in kind of performing, in a sense, the value of these very particular narratives, what kind of power they can build, really. I thought that was great. Thank you so much. Brinton is going to finish off for us today. Brinton, hi. Brinton is Professor of Community Cultural Psychology and also a co-director of the Center for Human Rights and International Justice at Boston College. So Brinton, it's lovely to have you here.
Thank you so much, Corinne, for being a part of this process, and to everyone here. I feel like I could reiterate my 5-minute presentation multiple times in light of the extraordinary presentations of others. So thank you all. I begin sort of echoing Mark's comments about Elliot Mishler, realizing that I knew Elliot as a social activist before I ever became a part of the Narratives group. And this book and the opportunity to write about an individual life that is my own and one, the key informant with whom I worked, is really in some way a way of positioning myself in narrative psychology, despite the fact that I was a part of that group that Mark mentioned for several decades. Most of my work has been with participatory action research, documenting community struggles, writing with and alongside large numbers of people. I start also recognizing, as I did in the book, that part of my concern now is really a critique of human rights and transitional justice activism, or of the truth and reconciliation processes that Michelle and her colleague Lauren and others so nicely interrogated, or that Robin Kelly is interrogating now in questioning whether or not we can talk about reparations without talking about decolonization. And I also want to echo a comment that was made earlier about the pluriverse, that is, starting with, as I did in this chapter, the Oaxacan unintellectual Gustavo Esteva, by his own naming, and the Indian United Statesian colleague Madhu Prakash, who say human rights are in fact social constructions. They are cultural inventions and not natural discoveries. They're historical facts, and they can be enriched by others as much as it enriches others' cosmovision. Every abstraction, every conceptualization, every classification and codification needs to be embraced with humility, and it is only one possible act of relation. The act of knowing is always confirmed as a subjectivity specified by location in cultural times and space. And I think in many ways the multiple chapters of the book demonstrate this in very particular ways. I want to make two brief points from the chapter and then one point about where the chapter may be walking as it has been translated back into Spanish and is being returned to the woman with whom it was developed. The first of these 2 points has to do with the fact that as human rights activists seeking reparation and redress through processes of transitional justice, we have, I think, in fact, relied upon tropes that were developed by activists and protagonists who accompanied internationalists seeking truth and seeking justice through processes that are deeply constrained and that limit how people can narrate their stories and what ways in which women in particular can position themselves. These mechanisms were designed and constrained by the law in many cases and marginalized stories of resistance and protagonism. That is, they don't allow for the Maya and the Ladina who sought a more just and equitable country through armed struggle and nonviolent social movements to tell these stories, because you either have to be an innocent victim, which allows you to testify, which also excludes the notion of a complex victim. That is, many people were perpetrators as well as victimized by this violence. So protagonists who sought social transformation through structural change have not been allowed to tell their stories, which have been frequently marginalized, and constrain certain people in telling them in certain ways. In an earlier interview with Maria Isabel that took place in 1995, I wrote about the ways in which she had silenced her own resistance, her own rebellion, her own engagement as a young activist in the revolutionary process when she returned from exile in Mexico after that historic moment. And I described that as self-silencing and as a strategy that she was using in order to re-engage and recreate herself in some ways. But also, I was more deeply drawn to the stories of several of her sisters who had also participated in these processes, but who had opted to tell those stories and to live those stories publicly. And so part of the book chapter is about how do we co-construct narratives? And what is it about our own positionality in these historical moments that allow for the creation of these stories and also constrain the creation of these stories? And the second point then has to do with the importance of reflexivity and also revisiting stories. A strategy that Kathy Reisman has taught me a lot about through her own work, and that has permitted me rethinking silence and seeing how many Maya have performed silence in order to resist participating in some of these processes that others have found to be so important in the transitional justice process. And then finally, what does it mean to say the story might walk into other arenas of social justice and social change work? And that is coming through the colleague and friend of mine who has retranslated the story for me into a better Spanish than I can write. And we'll meet with Maria Isabel, a pseudonym for the informant, who's a long-term friend of mine and the person who introduced me to the rural community of Chahul, where I've worked for many decades. And that is to use Maria Isabel's story as a potential route for gathering more stories that have been marginalized and suppressed, as Guatemala moves into not an optimistic moment and the brief moment of what some people call the judicial springtime, which saw the prosecution of some of the perpetrators of these violations, but rather a continuum of violence where international extractive industries are continuing to marginalize Maya from their territories, and also to engage in a kind of corruption that facilitates the kind of oppressive structures of neoliberal capitalism that continue to dominate Guatemala, but also the United States, and push people north as we stop them at the border with Mexico in horrific policies and practices. So I'll end that with the notion that these narratives, I think, are critically important, as Michelle and Lauren documented, for the next generation to connect to past generations and to discern new ways of being activists and activist scholars, because I think we, in our multiple generations represented here, have contributed importantly to this process, but are deeply limited by our own experiences and by our own generational interfaces with these structural realities. Thank you all.
Brenton, thanks so much. That's I think that just relates really well to some of the other work on perhaps not the most predictable kinds of narrative disruption that are documented in this book, and that I found very powerful to read, actually. Thanks so much. I'm going to suggest we just pass straight to some discussion. If people have questions and contributions they want to make, Molly is going to moderate that, I think. So Molly, thank you so much. And thanks to all the authors who had to race through things to give you an idea of what was going on in the book. Thanks a lot to all of you.
So at this point, if you want to, because there's quite a few of us, it's hard for me to see anybody. I don't see any hands, actually. I don't know if anybody has either a question for any of the people who have spoken before, or any comments. We also understand that it is a Friday afternoon, if not later, depending on where you are. So it's not required that we've already gone past the 4:30. So.
Hi, Molly, I'd like to ask a question, please.
Hello, Michelle. Yeah, lovely.
Hi. Really, this is for Ken. First of all, I'd love to say thank you so much for your absolutely phenomenal book, Narrative Power. It really has had an impact on the way that I think about narratives. And I'm really interested in your in what you think about narrative futures and how you see that. You mentioned that a bit earlier. Could you speak a bit more on that, please?
Yes, I thought we were finishing at 4:30, but thank you very much for asking that at 4:30. Well, in Narrative Power, as you know, the final chapter does deal with narrative futures in a way. I wasn't very satisfied with it, and I suppose I've gone on to a new book, which is called Narrative. Well, it isn't called Narrative Humanity, it's called Critical Humanism. But it has a chapter called Narrative Humanity in it. And I know that I'm going to get into a lot of hot water with it, because humanism and the idea of the human being has been more or less 100% debunked by most intellectuals. And it's also been debunked by most religious people, which only leaves a very small group of people who have any kind of conception of humanity at all left. And yet it's a word that's used all the time. So that my quick answer to your question is that my sense of a narrative future is a multiple one, a fragmented one, of course, a contradictory one, and all the rest of it. But it's got to be tied together by an underlying conception of a common connective humanity, which links us with the earth, with other people and relationships, with communities, with social institutions of all kinds, and with ultimately the planet, and teases those together. And that will always be changing in different groups and so forth, but it brings with it a certain commitment, a certain value to other people, and a shared otherness. So it will necessarily involve values of justice, values of fairness, values of care, values of sustainability, and right across a whole spectrum of different values. But they will manifest themselves in different ways, and it's a long, long struggle. But it's a kind of perception that all these myriads of struggles, I mean, and there are, I mean, the interesting thing is, okay, there are 9 struggles in this book, but I'm sure you're engaged in a number of struggles. I am, and we all are. And when you start looking at other books, you realize the whole world's full of struggles, people trying to make the world a better place, billions of them going on. And for some reason, we're dominated by nasty narratives that sort of tell us that the world is actually dominated by the economy, or it's dominated by science, or it's dominated by conspiracy groups, or all sorts of other things. And in fact, if we could find some common ground for humanity, we might be able to, over a period of time, I won't see it, but you know, we may get somewhere. And there aren't many words you can use which bring us together. Humanity is one of them. So that's my quick answer.
That is
I will posit another word that brings humanity together, and Molly and Corinne will probably know what word I'll say, and it's carnival.
Well, carnival, I love it.
Carnival. And that's my research, and everything you say is my vision of carnival and how I feel about carnival, because it very much brings not the neoliberal side of it, the actual raw crux of it. Thank you very much for that, Ken.
Well, good luck with the carnival.
Yeah, well, you will love, Michelle does really extraordinary work on Notting Hill Carnival here in London, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful project. And Ken, these comments have stirred quite a few comments as well from Jill Bradbury. Thank you for this idea of common collective humanity. From Corinne, about how this idea relates to, and I don't know how to say the surname, Akile Membe's work. From Brinton, talking about the work on the Commons, which William Ryan wrote many years ago, and now Mary Watkins has taken up. And then back to Jill for a future of these ideas of critical humanism, the loss and debunking the Enlightenment human is not the end of this critical project. So you can see that for a Friday afternoon, I'm telling you, people are, you know, still very, very awake here, you know. So thank you so much for that. Are there any other comments or questions? Corinne, I might turn over to you then if you want to just to close our event. Thank you everyone for such a wonderful offerings and incredibly great, I don't even want to say audience, being together. So Corinne, over to you.
Molly, thanks so much for shepherding us through all this, and to all of the contributors. I just got the feeling, having listened to you and seeing all the comments in the chat, that this is a kind of expanding project, that a lot more books like this one could be written now. And I just hope all of you go away and do that, or do whatever you do instead of writing the books, which performs the same kind of function. Thanks so much, and do be in touch. We'll send you the chat record and of course the recording record as well. And do join us again soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.